Hello, everyone. Welcome to the last of our four-part webinar series, Teaching in Real Time, How Well Does the American Federal System Respond to Public Health Crises? Tonight, we will focus on how all of these ideas we've been talking about translate into the classroom, and in particular, how you could use We the People as a foundation for teaching in real time about an important event. Again, on behalf of Kansas State University's Center for Social Studies Education, the Center for Civic Education, and the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation, welcome to the last webinar. I'll go over some administrative details at the end of tonight's webinar, but we would like to start this last webinar with a few words from one of our sponsors, the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation. On the first night, we heard from the Center for Civic Education. So on the last night, it seems altogether fitting that we would hear from the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation and attorney at Shook, Hardy, and Bacon, Coleman McCarthy. Coleman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and please emphasize the first title rather than the second. Forget that I'm a lawyer for a few minutes, please. As Dr. Tom, thank you, Dr. Tom, always a pleasure to be with you. As Dr. Tom said, I'm Coleman McCarthy. I'm the Executive Director of the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation. It's our great pleasure to help sponsor this series of webinars. The topic is timely. The people involved are intellectual luminaries. Professor Schechter, thank you for all the work you've put into these. It's an honor to help support and fund this. The foundation, just to say a few words about the foundation. It started way back. Its roots run back to the early mid-90s when a few Kansas high schools tried to ban an award-winning book called Annie on My Mind. And they tried to ban that book because it treated with LGBTQ issues. Obviously the Constitution had something to say about that, and a group of students sued to get the book back on the shelves in those school libraries, and they won, which is not surprising. And as a result of that win, the school districts had to pay a certain amount of attorney's fees. My firm, of course, was leading the charge on that case. Gene Balloon and David Waxy, if you don't know either of them, I pity you. You have my condolences. You should know them. They're wonderful people. They spearheaded that case pro bono, and the attorney's fees that were recouped were donated as seed money to start the foundation, all the way back in 1999, I believe. Since then, some of the activities that we've been involved with, which go to our core mission, which is to raise awareness of First Amendment issues in the Constitution generally among high school students, but we're not picky. We hope to help everybody raise their awareness of those issues. And some of the events that we put on to accomplish that mission include our speaker series. We brought in Justice Sandra Day O'Connor. We brought in leading Professor Lawrence Tribe when it comes to constitutional issues, and then noted First Amendment lawyer Floyd Abrams. Upcoming, we have plans to go a little more virtual in the future, not just because of COVID-19, but because, things just keep getting more techy all the time, and these young kids really like the tech stuff. Anyway, we're planning to go to a greater rotation, but do things virtually with our upcoming speakers. We're still in the planning stages of that, but we hope to have something to announce soon. And that's kind of it. Once again, thank you to everybody for attending. Thank you to everyone who put this on, Dr. Tom, Kansas State University, the Center for Civic Education, and then again, Professor Schechter, thank you so much. And it's an honor, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Coleman, thank you so much. If you don't mind me saying, in addition to all the great things that the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation does, I'd like to also point out that you're so good at making selections about who to support. I mean, Sandra Day O'Connor, Lawrence Tribe, Tom Bonce, Stephen Schechter. These are all worthy, notable people to support.
Absolutely.
So we really appreciate that. In all seriousness, for the folks on this webinar, the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation has been our primary sponsor, them and the Center for Civic Education, of course. And without their support, we would not have the kind of vibrant and healthy We the People program that we do in Kansas. They've literally helped thousands of Kansans understand more about their Constitution and what it means and how to apply it to real issues in the world today. So thank you so much again, Coleman. All right, so that leads us to the last webinar. And again, I'm really excited to hear from Matt and Ken and Robert and talking about how we translate the conceptual foundations that Stephen talked about in webinar 1, the historical context that he talked about in webinar 2, and all of the current issues surrounding COVID. And we weren't able to get to all of them, legal issues, philosophical issues, social issues, economic issues, and so forth. But how can a teacher translate all of that into a workable curriculum? And so without further ado, I will introduce Matt and Ken first, who have been dear friends and award-winning teachers for many years now. Matt is department chair at Blue Valley Northwest, a social studies teacher, and also teaches at Rockhurst University and is just an extraordinary educator. And Ken Thomas, I mean, what more do I need to say by way of introduction other than, like all great people, he has a Nebraska connection, as I do as well. And actually, Ken student taught in the same school that I was a high school teacher at many years ago. And Ken is just one of those really rare, exceptional people, human beings. I won't even just say teachers, in that he's always thinking about how to better other people. I mean, even in the context of We the People and it's competitive and so forth, he has done everything in his power to help every teacher in Kansas improve their teaching. And really, I think secretly, Ken hopes that these teachers beat him at some point in the Kansas competition. So Ken and Matt, the floor is yours, and I'll come back again when, geez, 59 people here. That's awesome. I'll give the floor. I'll take the floor back from you when you're done.
Great, and thank you, Tommy. Thank you for embarrassing me a great deal. I greatly appreciate that. But it's a pleasure, and it's been great to work with Coleman. I'm on the board of the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation with him. And one of the big things that I always, when I become involved in an organization, I always have to ask, okay, what is their number one priority? And with the Center for Civic Education and Bob Lemming, and with the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation, everything that we talk about, it always comes down to the question, how is this going to help kids? How is this going to make better citizens? How is this going to impact our future in a positive way? And I think that says a lot about all those things. Now, what we are going to do now is we are going to turn it over to Bob Lemming and Mark Gage in just a moment. And Bob is going to talk about the Center for Civic Education and We the People hearings, and is going to talk about the format of the hearings and go through a brief description of the 6 units. And then Mark is going to go ahead and show a video from this year's National Final Challenge, which we ended up having to do virtually for the very first time. And then we will come back, and Matt and I will come back, and we will talk about kind of how to integrate these kind of ideas into our classrooms, how we've done hearings, etc. And then at the end, we'll bring back Dr. Schechter and Dr. Vance for about 20 minutes of question and answer for the end. So what I would like to do now is I would like to once again introduce Robert Lemming, the director of the We the People program at the Center for Civic Education, to go ahead and talk about the center's program and how that all works. So Bob, you're up to bat.
Thanks, Ken. It's great to see you and everybody and all the folks that are out there in webinar land. As you notice from the slide you're seeing, that Dr. Schechter decided to concentrate his ideas and talks based on a question. And this is an example of a very good, I think, We the People question, if you want to call it that, where we ask a main question, usually with some kind of intriguing quote, and then a couple follow-up questions that we posed students. This was sort of the driving behind the scenes idea that shaped this particular webinar. If we can get to the next slide on the curriculum, that would be nice. In terms of, yeah, there we go. For those of you that don't know, the We the People textbooks are upper elementary, middle, and high school. In fact, we actually now have a new a lower elementary a textbook as well. It's quite brief. They're based on, as you can see, the 6 units. And if you notice right away, the titles of the 6 units are all questions. Because that's what we're driving. We're not saying this is the philosophical and historical foundations. What are they? And we have a chance to discuss those in terms of what are the foundations for our American political system. The second unit, how did the framers create the Constitution? What was the process behind coming together and barely making it, if you will, in terms of voting for a Constitution? And then, how has the Constitution been changed to further the ideals contained in the Declaration of Independence? Obviously, we see that as a foundational document it's sort of our mission statement, if you will, and why we think it's important not only for Americans at the time, but anybody to declare their independence from a government that they feel is tyrannical. And then Unit 4, or how have the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practices? That one deals with the 3 branches of government: the United States Supreme Court, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, as well as the concept of federalism. That's the other big idea in Unit 4. And that's where the sort of connection to this hearing question, to this content, would fit into our scheme of ideas in our textbooks. Unit 5, one of my favorites, is what does the Bill of Rights protect in terms of the first 10 amendments and what do they mean, including discussions of the 9th and 10th Amendment, which gives states power, as well as suggests that there are rights out there that we haven't listed. And then lastly, maybe most importantly, is what challenges might face American constitutional democracy in the 21st century? Well, we're seeing one right now, and we're dealing with it. This unit sets up students to once they have an understanding of the history of foundational ideas, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the branches of government, what about rights? What do you do with it then? Can you be, or should you be, an active participant in our republic? It's not enough, in my mind, to just know these ideas. It's important, I believe, for a successful democratic republic that some amount of citizens are involved in some way. And there are various ways that that's accomplished. What I like most about the We the People textbooks and curriculum is the performance-based assessment and educational needs, if you will. It's an assessment that, look, I'm a big time, I think tests are great and we should test students frequently in different ways. But one way to do it also is a performance-based one where hearing questions like the one Stephen Schechter wrote are given to kids up front and take time to, they're not a pop quiz. They're, let's research these. Let's find out opinions about these, because they're open-ended kinds of questions if you read them. And the chart you're seeing here now is on our website, where you can get hearing questions at different levels and from past. We have quite a bank of questions that are there for teachers to use whenever. I find it interesting when I've talked to alum who are off in a political science course someplace, and all of a sudden their professor pulls out one of these hearing questions because they found them on the website, and they laugh because they did it in high school. And their comments like, well, you must be one of those We the People kids because you actually know something when you come into my political science 101 class. That's the kind of thing I like to hear. As Ken said, my philosophy has always been, this is about the kids. It's about how do we help them understand big ideas and principles that are at the foundation of our democratic republic and beyond that. And the other thing is, I'm somewhat famous for saying that kids are victims to what teachers don't know. And what I mean by that is my career and the folks on the screens that you've seen for the last 4 days have all been about helping teachers learn more. I think it's quite ridiculous to think that a young teacher coming out of any college and starts to teach knows everything there is to know about teaching government or civics. They must continue their learning throughout their career. That's why I'm so impressed with the numbers of people that are here. I suspect most of you are teachers out there, maybe not all, but that you understand that you have the responsibility to learn more than you knew coming out of college in your entire life. I mean, we expect lawyers to do it. We expect doctors to do it. I expect teachers to do that. That's what we have a responsibility to do, because without your leadership, most young people, I'm not gonna say all, there are kids that go to school that could do this on their own, but most kids need guidance. And I think what I find interesting is the teachers that tell me, because I push my students in a direction of learning this based on these particular hearing questions, they actually know more about this topic than I do now. That is where we want to go. We take the teacher and the student and reverse, and end up the student becomes the teacher at some point and helps their colleagues. That's the other thing cool about the We the People hearings and participation in the simulated congressional hearings. Students are encouraged to work together in teams. There's 6 units. If you had a class of 24, you'd break them into groups of 4. And they work together on a particular unit. You see in front of you a national finals question from unit 6 that was used at the national finals challenge that Ken alluded earlier. I'd like to read it to you. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Never in the history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity. What lessons can be learned from the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama? What is civic engagement and what is its significance in American history? What responsibility, if any, do schools have to promote civic education?" Well, that's a pretty tough question that I'm assuming you wouldn't ask a student to sit down with never seeing this and never researching it to write about. But if you give them time to think about it and to research and find out and make opinions about these topics, and then allow them to demonstrate those ideas in front of judges, acting as members of Congress in the simulated hearing part of it. And those judges are university professors of law, history, and political science, lawyers, real judges, elected officials, journalists, anybody that has some idea of how the Constitution works, then has a chance to interact with young people about these kinds of ideas. The students know this question and those bullets, and they have time to prepare for that, but that's only the 4-minute part of the opening statement of the entire hearing. Then some people suggest the rubber hits the road when the judges start asking the kids questions that they're not prepared for, that relate to these ideas. For example, one follow-up question might be, what do you think about civil disobedience, and what kinds of issues would you use civil disobedience as a way to suggest change for America? The kids then would have to respond on their toes about this in the group of 4 kids. Now, what we have for you here now is a tape of our national finals that Ken referred to, one class answering that particular question. We'd like to show it to you. I think this is pretty cool because what we had to do on March 11th was maybe the most difficult professional day of my life so far, was to cancel the national finals because of COVID-19 and disappoint 1,200 kids who were supposed to be there, and all the judges and all of the workers. And my boss at the time, Chuck Quigley, said to me, "Lemming, can you do something?" And I said, "I don't know. This is pretty devastating." Well, we thought through it, and a number of people and I came up with, Mark Gage particularly, came up with the idea of holding a Zoom hearing with 30 classes, 645 kids, 36 judges, 12 facilitators, and a number of staff members. We held 90 hearings, half-hour hearings on Saturday, and 90 again on Sunday, with little problems, mic problems, some of them, and so forth. These kids found their way to the Zoom hearing on time all across the country. And you're going to see an example of that right now. Can we unmute that?
Hey, Tommy.
Yoder. I'm the chairman of the Professional Standards and Practices Commission of Pennsylvania. And I taught for 37 years in the Allentown School District, where I did We the People. So thank you for continuing the tradition, even from Zoom and far away.
If you would introduce yourselves.
I'm Abby Scott.
My name is Symphony Fike.
And I'm Andrew Sutton. We are representing Unit 6. We are from Laurel High School in Montana, and our teacher is Mr. Deming.
All right. Well, I will read the question, give you time for your opening statement. We have selected question number 1. In 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King said, "Never in history of this nation have so many people been arrested for the cause of freedom and human dignity. What lessons can be learned from the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama? What is civic engagement, and what is the significance in American history? What responsibility, if any, do schools have to promote civic engagement?" You may begin.
Children's March was a week-long series of nonviolent demonstrations. More than 1,000 school children from all over Birmingham took part, and hundreds were arrested. The march is a part of history, but it cannot remain merely history. The Children's March can teach many lessons. The first is that young people can affect change. This is no different from many kids today. The March for Our Lives and school climate strikes are proof. These movements are led by young people who see where they believe the world is going wrong and try to fix it. Dina Avery wrote a book about her father and his part in the Children's March. We asked her what lessons she thought the world could learn from the march. She said, "The children of 1963 were determined for their voices to be heard, and these children were willing to take an unprecedented stand for equal rights." We also learned about civil disobedience. Henry David Thoreau said, "Under a government which imprisons any unjustly, the true place for a just man is also a prison." The children of Birmingham were arrested for disobeying a law that forbade them from demonstrating. They knew that the unjust laws would never change if they didn't take a stand. We can also learn a lesson of respect for human beings. The march was widely known because the news showed children being attacked with fire hoses and police dogs. Freeman Habrowski III was 12 years old when he marched and was in prison. He said, "If you can imagine children encaged, it was worse than prison. It was like being treated like little animals. It was awful, crowded. Unfortunately, we don't have to imagine. We have seen children in cages and separated from their parents in our country today. The lessons that the country should have learned from the march about equality and the importance of coming together need to be revisited today."
We believe that civic engagement can be defined as participating in your community to make a change for the common good. This can be through voting, serving on a jury, participating in community events, and exercising your rights. Throughout history, you can see Americans fighting for what they believe is a right through protest, wars, and other actions to make a change for themselves. According to Cicero, public life and public service required making personal sacrifices for the common good. You can see sacrifices like this throughout American history. It first started when Americans came together to fight for their freedom and the common good in the American Revolutionary War. Then in the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, women's suffrage, gay rights movement, and many different social groups standing for what's right by utilizing their rights and participating in their communities to improve the common good.
We believe that it is a school's responsibility to promote civic engagement, but not force it. This would take the voluntary out of voluntary associations. Due to this, we disagree with the ruling in Steerer versus Bethlehem School District. From the 28th annual Gallup poll, 86% of respondents said that preparing students to be responsible citizens was very important. Schools can fulfill their responsibility to promote civic engagement through both formal and informal civic education. Formal instruction includes classes about civics and government, while the informal curriculum includes the co-curricular activities that a school provides, such as We the People. Congress echoed a premise about civic education understood by our founders in classical republicanism when it passed Goals 2000, where 2 of the 8 national goals dealt specifically with civic education. Civic education is essential to sustain a federal republic. Alexis de Tocqueville pointed out, "Each new generation is a new people that must acquire the knowledge and develop the dispositions of private and public character that make up a federal republic." Citizens should be educated in self-governance and actively involved, not just passively accepting the direction that others give. Aristotle thought the ideals of democracy are most completely realized when every member of the political community shares in its governance. In Robert Dahl's idea of engagement, he thought that we had a choice. We could either rule ourselves or give up and let the elites rule us. But ultimately, there is no way to rule ourselves without engagement. We are now ready for your questions.
Thank you. So one of the questions I have, you mentioned in your opening statement about the common good, as we kind of see today with differing views on governments from Georgia to Texas to Wisconsin, California, Indiana, wherever, different views on the common good. Do you think that there's one common good, or do you think that there are 50 common goods, or more than that? Can you speak to that?
So I think that the common good is different for each person because everyone interprets what that is differently. And I think that it especially can be different among generations. So for young people, the common good might be one thing, and for older people, it might be another thing. And I think that it's up to each person to determine what the common good is for them and then work towards that.
So
I also know that everyone works towards the common good, and all of these different protests are happening with the common good. For example, the coronavirus, about 30 different states have been participating in these protests because they believe that the common good is for us not to have these stay-at-home quarantines. And they also, well, the majority of Americans, they took a poll, and about 81% of Americans said that they disagreed with these protests. And so I think that there are multiple different common goods as well.
All right. So I'm curious,
what issue and activity, if anything, are you willing to be hit by high power water cannons, face vicious snarling dogs, and being taken to jail? What issue and activity would you face those for?
So for me, I think that the children of the Birmingham Children's March were incredibly brave to face something like that. And I know that it would be difficult for me to put myself in that position, but if I had to choose anything, I think it would be the situation at the border right now with, like I mentioned in my prepared remarks, the children who are being separated from their parents. And we understand that there is the Flores settlement that governs the treatment of minors in custody at the border, but I still think that separating the children from their parents at all is much too harsh, especially for young children. And so I think that if I was going to take a stand for anything, it would be that.
I think I have the same disposition as the people or the children in Hong Kong right now. There are tens of thousands of youth who are participating in these demonstrations for their freedom of democracy, and over 900 of them have been imprisoned. And what they say is that they are willing to even die for democracy and freedom and helping their future generations get that.
I would take a stand for the LGBTQ community. Transgender people are actually half of the community that they face abuse, whether sexually or just in general abuse against them. So I would be willing to stand up against abuse in the LGBT community, and I would take a water cannon into the face anytime for that.
At what point would you then make the decision, or is it a valid decision, to take your civil discourse if your demands are not met, to resort to violence? Do you think violence is ever justified to accomplish the ends of your civic engagement?
I do not think violence is ever justified with making means for civic engagement. I know during the time of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was kind of that person that was shown as willing to do anything for violence to get what he believed. But later in his life, when he took a pilgrimage to Mecca, he had a realization that he was wrong and that white people were just as equal as Black people and that violence should not be used towards that.
I would agree with what Symphony said, and I would also say that I think I would never resort to violence because we can see that things do get accomplished even through nonviolent methods, like with Gandhi and the independence movement from India, from Great Britain. He was able to lead a huge number of people in strictly nonviolent protests, and they did become independent.
And not only that, but in the United States, we are protected to protest under the First Amendment, freedom of expression. So by peacefully protesting, it allows for us to legally stand up for what we believe is right, and by adding violence to it and getting involved with that, it would create a legal barrier that would allow for cops to arrest people.
So if this were 1776, you would reject the Declaration of Independence?
I think 1776 is a different issue entirely. I think that Jefferson had a quote that said, "While ills are sufferable, we'll suffer them." And so while for the people of that time, they could see no other option. Like they couldn't nonviolent protest their way out of this one. Their only choice was to start a revolutionary war. And that's because for them, the ills were no longer sufferable.
And another quote by Alexis de Tocqueville states that civilized nations don't revolt unless the people feel like they have nothing less to lose. So at that point, once you feel like you have nothing left to lose, that's whenever people start to really take more violent actions. And that's like the Declaration of Independence. Whenever we declared our independence, that didn't directly mean that violence was going to ensue, but it was most likely going to happen.
We can also see that there are some consequences of sometimes not practicing civil disobedience, such as with the Nuremberg Trials after World War II, where they were charged with not going against their laws because of the amount of destruction that happened in Germany.
With the 2 seconds we have left, I'd like to ask about the parents. Do you think, the parents of the children that were participated in the Birmingham March, do you think that they were contributing to the cause, or do you think that they were exploiting their kids?
So I think that the parents were just as sympathetic towards the cause, but I think in their case, they possibly had more to lose, like with their jobs. And I had been reading many firsthand accounts of the Children's March, and a lot, should I keep going?
Yes.
And A lot of the parents were encouraging their children to go out there and protest because they could not themselves for fear of putting their family at risk.
All right. Nice. Give you a few comments and some feedback. Excellent presentation. I thought it was particularly organic in terms of you all work together very well as a team, and kind of seamlessly kind of go through that. And I've said this before on some of the other units, the idea or the notion of being able to raise your hand and signal to your other teammates that you have something to say, I think is particularly useful. So this format kind of helps with that. If I had one suggestion of criticism, I would say in your paper to slow down a little bit in delivery. Doesn't affect content, doesn't affect the scoring, but just make sure that you're slowing down and giving a thoughtful presentation that way. I particularly appreciated your interjection of quotes and de Tocqueville into today. So the idea of applying those concepts to today and applying those theories and kind of incorporating them into what we're seeing today is particularly useful. So thank you for your presentation. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, I also very much enjoyed your presentation, and I'm also going to comment on the fact that you use a lot of very applicable quotes. I've seen presentations where there are lots of quotes, but the quotes weren't necessarily really pertinent to the question. You were able to find quotes that were very pertinent and applicable to the question itself. So I thought that was very well done. Also thought your answers to the cross-examination questions were very well done and equally based on your personal feelings. And I've always told students that we expect a very good 4-minute presentation, but it's in the cross-examination where we can really determine whether or not they've done some thought, done some preparation, analyze all the issues that could arise from the question. You did a very good job. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I too want to mirror that. I thought you did a wonderful job. I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I mean, you've handled it well with a lot of quotes and made them very germane to the issue at hand. I wish I had more time. You mentioned the Bethlehem case, which actually is right next door to Allentown, not 5 minutes away from where I live. And I found it interesting you were to use that because while it is civic engagement, the focus of it is volunteerism. I'm not sure it really drove students more in the civic realm in terms of engaging in politics, engaging in protests or things like that. So it's an interesting experiment over there that's still going on. And many students view it as just another project. And that's pretty much it. That's sad. But interesting that you went there as a case. You handled the questions very well. Any parents listening behind the doors or any on the other side of the computer, I got to applaud your students. They did a very good job. Thank you for supporting your students.
Okay. Thank you for watching that. Mark, you can take that off the screen now. I don't think we want to watch all of that other stuff. I'm seeing a blank screen of Schechter, not the slideshow. Is that just me?
Yeah, it's just you on now, Bob.
Okay. That was an example of a high school hearing. Unfortunately, you didn't see it in the gallery view, which you could see all of the judges and all of the students, the state coordinator, and the facilitator working the event. So I encourage you, if you want to sort of check one of those videos out to see what that looks like. Also, you need to understand this happens not only at the high school level, but the middle school level and the elementary level. Some of the most amazing hearings I've ever seen are with elementary students. I recall one student, a fifth grader, saying, sometimes democracy is like a messy house. We've got to clean it up. And I thought that was just, for a fifth grader, was pretty up there. So I encourage all of teachers as a way to assess their students, whether you get involved in the competition aspect of it. I encourage that too, because it's fun. But I encourage teachers when they're thinking about how to assess their students, and they have to think about that this is one way that you may want to go with. There are rubrics to help you score that. And I'm sure that Matt and Ken have ideas about how they might score that. I know lots of teachers that use a hearing as a final exam. Tom Vance and I teach online courses, so does Stephen Schechter, and we've used sort of a hearing format for our final exams for grad students. So I think it works, and it can work at multiple levels. And you now have some experts on the screen that can talk about that. Is there anything else you wanted me to talk about, Ken?
No, I think that's great. Thank you, Bob. You did a tremendous job. And I think, you know, one of the things that really brought this program to me was, you know, the passion that the kids get for this process. And it's not us telling them what to think. It's them going ahead and doing the research and digging to deep levels, which is why every year when I talk to my kids, no matter which group that I'm working with, whether it's a U.S. history or a on-level government class or my AP kids or my actual competitive group, you know, I talk about it. It's like a bloomin' onion at Outback Steakhouse. Because it starts with this round thing, and that's kind of when you get the question, and then you start digging, and it begins to open up, and then you put the paper together, and that's kind of putting the covering on it, and then you stick it in the fryer, and then it comes out, and the performance is, of course, the great meal that you have with this situation. And the kids finally understand that about halfway through, that when they're looking at the material that they're going through. What we're going to do very quickly is Matt is going to talk a little about problem-based learning, which is, of course, a lot of the Edges Speak Now that groups are going to. And then we are going to go ahead and he's going to talk about how he integrates hearings into AP US history. And then he'll turn it back over to me. I will briefly talk about government and regular US history. And then we will kind of switch and bring Mark in and talk about hearings on in the virtual realm, like you just saw. And Mark will help us kind of guide us on how to do this virtually rather than in a classroom. So Matt, without further ado, I will turn it over to you to talk about problem-based learning and what you do with it in APUSH.
Thank you, Ken. You know, we have the greatest job in the world being social studies teachers, teaching all kinds of different material, whether that's a geography or a history course or a civics course. And part of the challenge as a guy who sat and worked on several curriculum committees for my district and worked as department head in my department is not only that, but being a parent, I want my son and daughter, who are one in elementary school, one in middle school, as we all do as parents and people in the education community, we want them to be able to grow up to be able to use big ideas and big information to help guide their understanding of the world. The questions I face all the time from my students, what is freedom? Why has it happened that way? Why is that happening on the news? What's going on? Those are critical questions that I would like my students to not only have a great deal of knowledge, the historical knowledge and some working knowledge they can act on, but they also need to have some critical thinking skills, which we all know. And that pendulum in history and education swings back and forth. The argument about should we teach more content knowledge or less? Should we have more skill? And I think really in the middle, you find the sweet spot. And that's where I think, for me, the success has been with the teaching of We the People in my courses and with my time having worked with We the People and with this content. my goal in hoping that we could do this kind of activity and have a chance to work together to talk a little bit about COVID was that I know that many of my teachers that I worked with at Rockhurst in the methods course and other courses that I've taught there are really talking about how do I teach my students in a way that's not just teaching them something to memorize or teaching them just a skill. How do I put the two of them together? And so we actually use we the people in the classroom at Rockhurst to kind of give students an opportunity with that. And you know, the challenge of moving forward with that for our district was really focused around problem-based learning and the idea of how that works with Kathy Swan's research. Many of you have probably talked about that. It's been a big national conversation. And what I think is great about We the People is whether you're an individual who's going to go on to use this as a assessment tool, teach the content, the text is fantastic, as Mr. Lemming said, because not only does it provide the opportunity to provide really rich content for my students, and that's not just government students. You know, my AP American History kids really get excited about reading really powerfully written information that helps them understand their history. And so we use the We the People text throughout my class in AP American History to help support the content they're learning that's historically based. The how, the why. You know, the conversation we have at the beginning of the year, the problem we have at the beginning of the year for my courses is, what is American? And that question happens throughout the rest of the semester. And so as we look at that and work with that, one of the questions we start to look at, and as we go through time, are the questions posed for and by the Center for Civic Education that are regional questions, that are oftentimes state questions that are held. An example of that, we looked at the question in my AP American History course dealing with the idea of procedural due process and substantive due process that was asked last year. The question revolved around the idea of when, how much is okay, when should it be used, what should be done with it. And for my students who are just finishing studying the idea of the Civil War and Reconstruction, talking about the 14th Amendment, to start talking about the power of the 14th Amendment, which is just, I mean, it's huge for them. It's overwhelming to start thinking that now we're going to start taking the stuff they thought that originally, when they came into my class, was applied, those Bill of Rights were applied from the very beginning to people's rights at the state level, and then to have their minds blown that this 14th Amendment is such a powerful tool to change it. To talk about procedural due process and substantive due process was cool for them. And it was the connection piece for myself as a teacher that as we went through the content, I could refer back to. Remember when you did that hearing? And so the power of We the People is not just the performance, it's the teaching, it's the thought of the teaching. And so the idea to take this, which you saw, and I think you saw in the video, the power of the students, not only did they have a great working knowledge of the theory, the practical theory of how it works, but they also have a really good practical knowledge of some of the historical fact, and they have a great contemporary knowledge of those pieces. And to put that together, and then, you know, I got to tell you, one of the hardest things for me, I don't know if that's true for you, is to have students, I read so many papers all the time in AP American History where they just can't state their position. I read so many theses where I'm like, oh man, you got close. And so what's great about this process is I think it asks kids to really take a position and defend it, to use those skills they've gained from the knowledge they have. And I can't think of a more powerful tool I need in my students to be able to say, I think they're ready to go and leave my AP American History class, not only just to take exam, but more importantly, what I think we all do, which is to create amazing people. I want my students to be able to leave to create arguments. I want them to be able to have discussions. I want them to be able to defend a position and take a position. And those things are taught through the process, not just the content, but the skills. And so that problem-based and project-based learning is really the basis of what We the People is asking students to do. And so for my students, we do 3 hearings a year, 2 in first semester and 1 in second semester. And it is the performance piece for our course. And I don't compete. Obviously, we're an AP American History team, so competition isn't our goal. But for those students to have a chance, even just to have their high school principal come up and sit in the hearing, to have outside people that I invite to come in and have that hearing and listen to them share their ideas is really empowering for high school students. To be able to talk about what they believe and have support for what they believe and have a structure around it to create the argument is just really awesome. To see kids get excited and lit up about the possibility of being able to like make this happen. Just over the moon excited, and then to take those skills and pass it on to Ken. And so we've seen that process can be built in all classes. So we've started having students, whether that's when they enter in as freshmen, start working on those skills. And then the capstone of that would be Ken's class. And Ken has done a fantastic job at Northwest, taking those skills of We the People and putting them together, helping students think about the historical foundations, thinking about the theory, thinking about the court cases, to expose kids to the structure of how our government works and how the case law works, and put that all together. I think just really changes the chances. And I think oftentimes people think, well, this is just a government program, and I don't think it is. I think what's awesome about it is it's just a great teaching tool. It's an amazing way to get kids to think, and it's an amazing way to connect kids' knowledge together. And so for my American history kids, some of them don't go on to take Ken's class in AP American Government, but they go into regular American Government, and they have still those skills, I think, for a lifetime. And I think many times those skills transfer over. And even just the other day, I got a couple emails from students who were like, hey, we were talking about the idea of pandemics before you left, because we had talked about what was coming, and we had talked about current events, and we tried to apply those ideas of federalism. And so I hope that through this experience you've had tonight, you get to see how it could apply in so many ways. So much of what Dr. Schechner shared with us is awesome, and could really, I think, help bring the current time in and help us use those skills, so that we as a profession are not just teaching skills and not just teaching content, but marrying those and putting them together, to really get kids to be successful. So I just really thankful for you being here, and I'm going to hand it off to Ken so he can do his little piece, and then I'd like to open up to a conversation with Mark about how we can gauge about how we can have hearings and do these kind of things in a classroom. What's the practical application of it?
Okay, great. Thank you, Matt. I really appreciate that. Matt works very hard at preparing the kids for when they get up into my realm. I've also done it on the regular 11th grade U.S. history, kind of along the lines Matt was talking about, what it means to be an American. At the end of my on grade level U.S. history classes, I went ahead and at the end of the first semester, I asked the question, so what does it mean? How has what it means to be an American changed from 1776 to 1920? And then on my two follow-up questions that were part of that was also, had groups or individuals had more of an impact on that change? And what challenges do we face in the future? And then second semester, we went ahead and we brought it, how has it changed from 1776 to the present? And again, the same two follow-up questions. So we had some great answers, and the kids really did a great job with it. And I was really amazed at, the passion that they brought forward. And Matt talked about the skills that you develop. And there are multiple skills. As a matter of fact, one of my former students who graduated way back in 2006 said that that the We the People class had actually gotten him every single job that he had received after he left high school. So throughout college and actually after college, and then he ended up going into the government. But it was all because of the We the People program, because he said what happened was he had it on his resume, and the interviewers would ask him, what is this We the People thing? And he said, well, these are the skills that I got by doing the We the People program. And he talked about the ability to develop instant rapport with people, the ability to do professional research, the ability to think cognitively quickly on his feet, which is obviously what you saw in that video. And he said once he went through, and of course the professional writing skills as well, once he went through and actually went ahead and talked about all those things, he said, when I was done, they just looked at me and said, okay, those are the skills that we want our people in our business to have. And so he ended up getting every job that he talked about it with. So those are the kind of the things that this whole process brings us. As Bob referred to, this occurs on the elementary school level. It occurs on the middle school level. on the high school level, on the collegiate level, on the graduate level. And obviously what we have to do is when we're dealing with students, no matter what level we're dealing with, we have to look at where they are at that moment. All right. And obviously, you know, there are some issues on that we have talked about in the last few days, especially over the political issues that are probably not appropriate to be used on the elementary level, et cetera, and possibly on the middle school level. When Matt and I were first talking about this, I had brought COVID in to my online teaching after we closed our school down. And so I began to go, okay, let's look at our government response. Let's look at whether it is appropriate when we compare to what we know about the framing documents and what we know about the framers. Does it in fact reflect the views of the framers in crisis situations? But I also knew I had kids that were being directly affected by the COVID-19 situation. I had kids that whose parents were laid off. I had a student whose father was a surgeon and his father got laid off, yet he was going into hospitals to volunteer. And so I couldn't just barnstorm in and open it up to COVID because I had to think about the mental health of my students as well. So we tweaked it and made it questions about the government responses to various crises, such as the financial crisis of 2018, 9/11, Katrina, whatever the case may be. All right. So you have to go to and decide where your students are before you go ahead and go with this teaching, especially with a situation like this. Now, when we get to the government portion, my regular level government classes do hearings. My AP government classes do hearings, as do I have a competitive group of students that do these as well. You know, and with all of them, I begin the process at the very beginning of the semester. We go ahead and we start making presentations of material. They go ahead and use the textbooks. They do research in the textbooks. They go beyond. They present the lessons themselves. I don't sit there in front of them and present the lessons to them. You know, they present the material. Then we go ahead and we develop into a question and answer period where after they present, we begin to ask them questions over the material. So they have to begin to prepare for those follow-up questions and those types of things. So we bring that whole process to a culmination. And had I had a little bit more time this year, because we really didn't start back in school until right around April 1st this year, I would have culminated with a virtual hearing. However, unfortunately, I didn't have quite the time to do that. So we just basically did the writing and the discussing and me asking questions and those types of things through Zoom. But what we would like to do now is kind of transition and bring Mark in, because Mark is the guru as far as the ability to put on a virtual hearing. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mark and allow Mark to go ahead and kind of talk about how he went ahead and created this idea of an actual virtual hearing. So Mark, you got it.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Ken. So I wanted to share this web page here that I created today. And I'll go ahead and put that in the chat here after I'm done presenting. But this is basically a document that outlines how to conduct a We the People hearing online. You know, when Bob made the decision to pull the trigger and actually conduct these online hearings, that was a real gut check moment for us. We had 30 schools that were interested and that ultimately participated from throughout the entire country. And we had never done this before. We had never conducted a Zoom competition online. But with the help of our great volunteers, we did it. We got it done, and nothing terrible happened. So based on that, what happened then, I'm absolutely 100% confident that any teacher anywhere can do this in their own classroom. So this webpage is basically assumes that you are conducting a hearing for your class online. And what I recommend doing is using Zoom. You know, you might have restrictions. Your school, in fact, might have said, well, we're not allowing you to use Zoom because of all the Zoom bombing things that have taken place. This document gives you some practical tips on how to avoid Zoom bombing. And one of the major recommendations is to get support from your school's administration. And in here is a template, which is a letter. Here it is, about how to, and you can use this letter as a template and change it. I have a link to the Word document. Basically, it goes through everything you can do to prevent Zoom bombing. And for those of you who don't know what Zoom bombing is, it is you know, a bad actor, a malicious person coming into a Zoom meeting and just kind of wreaking havoc, sharing hate speech and, you know, terrible pictures and things like that that should not be shared with children, obviously. So this gives you some practical tips for what you can do to prevent Zoom bombing. And luckily we had, you know, I think it was 150 hearings or something like that, 180 hearings. We didn't experience any Zoom bombing. The key to that is taking all these precautions, all these security precautions, and they're very basic, and Zoom allows you to do that. You know, you're not posting the hearing links online, you're requiring a password, and you're using waiting rooms. Those are probably the three most important things to do. Now, when you use a waiting room, what that does in Zoom is it allows you to see who is requesting admission into the hearing. You, as the teacher, you're going to know who needs to be there. You know, you're going to admit just your students and the judges and, you know, the facilitator and maybe some observers who need to be there. You're not going to let in anybody you don't know. So go ahead and feel free to use this template to get the support, not only to figure out, you know, how to lock down your Zoom hearing by following all these steps, but also to communicate with your administration as to how you can effectively make the hearing a safe educational experience for your kids. So going back to this document, that's, you know, once you've decided what platform to use, whether it's Zoom or Google Hangouts, for example, I would get the consent of your administration. Get them on your side, bring them on as allies to help you conduct these hearings effectively. Then you're going to decide on a date and time for your hearings. That's really important. And of course, you're going to work with your volunteers and your administrators, and then you're going to set up your hearings in Zoom. Now, this paragraph here goes into what the order of things, you know, how this takes place. What I recommend, let's say you're conducting let's say you're a high school teacher and you're conducting a simulated hearing online. What I recommend is scheduling one meeting that's 3 hours long, right? Each hearing will take 30 minutes. I recommend you find 3 judges to judge the entire hearing, you know, to be there for 3 hours. and to listen to all the units and then score them. I recommend that you use only one question and then a bunch of follow-up questions. Now, if you do that, the question plus the follow-ups plus getting the kids all situated and squared away in the room will take about 30 minutes. So if you plan to start your hearing, the first hearing at 9 a.m., make sure the judges are in there, good 20 minutes early. Get them squared away. Make sure their mic is working. Make sure their video is working, and then send them to a breakout room. Okay, what a breakout room in Zoom is a separate room where you can send people where they have privacy. No one can see them and hear them, and they can't hear and see anyone else. So what that does, it's as if the judges were in a separate room, and then once the hearing starts, you bring them in, and they will. It's like the judge is entering a physical room. So then you bring in the students, and once again, using that waiting room, you're going to know, okay, my Unit 1 students are first. I know their names, and then you work with your facilitator to bring them in. Now, what a facilitator does is that person is both the facilitator who's kind of handling the software, so actually operating Zoom for you, so you don't have to worry about that as a teacher. And they're also, they're going to ask you, okay, can I let in this kid, this kid, this kid? They'll let them in from the waiting room for you. They're also checking the room at all times, checking the meeting, and making sure nobody's up to any mischief. Common tricks we see is, kids changing, as many of you know in this era of Zoom, kids changing to their name to be something offensive or whatever. That's why you're only letting in the kids that you know and who are accountable. You're not letting in the whole entire class at once. You're not letting in, you're not letting in the parents either. What I suggest you do is record the meeting so that the parents can watch later. And there's a few practical reasons for that. You don't want your meeting to get too big. You don't want the Zoom meeting to get, you don't want 80 people in there. You just want the kids, let's say it's 3 kids, plus 3 judges, plus the teacher, that's you, and the facilitator, and then you might have some guests, like the principal, for example, and maybe if the kids have had a unit coach, the unit coach. So you let those people in, and then the judges will introduce themselves, and you start the hearing. Now, the facilitator, as I said, is also the timer. So they're responsible for the 4-minute introduction, timing that. And we actually had the facilitators hold up a sign, a paper sign that said 1 minute. And then on the other side, it said, on the other side of the paper, it said time. So you're going to do this you're going to tell the kids to be in, and the judges, to be in gallery view rather than, speaker view. And what that means in Zoom is that you can see everybody at once. They're tiled like the Brady Bunch, if any of you remember the Brady Bunch show, where, I think that was the Brady Bunch anyway, where they all appear on screen at once and you can watch all their faces at once. So the facilitator will hold up the time sign and the 1 minute sign. And what I would caution you is that, kids have different socioeconomic conditions. They have different home situations. And I would definitely reinforce to the judges, you're judging them not on the quality of their tech, not on the quality of their video or their audio, not whether their kid brother is screaming in the background. You're judging them on the quality of their ideas. And you're going to have kids on their cell phones. As we saw, one of the kids in the videos we just watched was on their cell phones. And you're going to have kids on, really great equipment with great sound. But just keep that in mind. So the 30 minutes are 10 minutes of preparation, basically getting everybody set up, 10 minutes of the hearing, then 10 minutes of the judges giving their feedback, plus, and then after they're done, you send the kids from, let's say, Unit 1, you say, okay, thank you very much, great job, and now you can go ahead and leave the hearing room, and they'll leave the meeting, and then you send the judges back into a breakout room so that they can go ahead and do their scoring and talk amongst themselves in privacy. That's what we did, and it worked really well. And then you bring in the next group. So let's say at that point it's about 9:20, if for a theoretical 9 a.m. starting time. You bring in the next group of students starting at around 9:20, 9:25 for starting the next hearing at 9:30. I give you some practical tips on this page about enlisting volunteers to help you. The volunteers are what makes it work. Conducting an online hearing is very, very labor intensive. That's the unfortunate part. I think conducting any hearing requires a lot of setup, but you rely on your volunteers, such as your facilitator and judges, to make things run smoothly. I would encourage you to get a facilitator who is tech savvy, who's very comfortable with Zoom, and who can help you work with anybody else who needs to be involved, like the judges, okay? So I would advise you to make sure before the hearing begins, as you're getting this all set up, to make sure that the judges, the facilitator works with the judges to make sure their tech is all set up and they're good to go. And the main thing, practice, practice, practice. Many of the teachers who did really well were fanatics about practice. They made sure that their kids knew what to do. They made sure that everybody was all set up and good to go. So if you've done all that stuff, you'll be confident on the day of the event, and you'll be ready to have a successful presentation, a successful hearing. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out.
Great.
Ken, before you start, I just have to say, ladies and gentlemen, Mark Gage did such an incredible job in both in terms of helping our We the People kids actually participate in a national finals and did it kind of all at the last minute. And I was a judge, and it just went off smooth. And Mark's also been extraordinarily helpful here. Mark, you don't realize how many kids' lives you directly impacted by your work. This resource is fantastic. It's awesome. I guarantee you, if we're locked down in Kansas, we will be using everything that you just wrote. Ken, I turn it over to you. I just wanted to recognize Mark's outstanding contribution.
Thank you, Mark. And I just wanted to very quickly, before I turn it back over to you, Tom and Stephen, we are planning on not going away. Basically, we're looking at having monthly or so Zoom meetings that you would be able to come into to help support you in the process through whatever curriculum, or help you figure out how to hold the hearings and those types of things, recruit folks. We're going to do this periodically. We're brainstorming how best to get this done right now. So I think, this is not a one-shot done kind of deal. We're going to be here in the future as well to help you have a successful program, whether it be on the elementary school, on the middle school, or on the high school level. Resources, they're going to send out Matt and my information, so you can email me at any time. And I'm sure Mark, if you have technical questions, Mark as well. So we're here to help you. So thank you very much for your patience and listening. And now I will turn it back over to our in control guy, and Dr. Schechter.
Well, thanks so much, Ken and Matt and Robert and Mark. Outstanding description. And by the way, you can use hearings at any level in almost any subject. And and I think that you've gotten a good feel for the hearings, and in particular how the hearing questions can change, and they do change every year, and relate to current issues. As it turns out, COVID-19 obviously was a big part of last year's national finals. Even though there wasn't a question directly about COVID-19, it shows up in every unit because it was on everyone's minds. And so we turn things over to Dr. Schechter for just a real quick overview of some of the ways that you can connect public health to the curriculum. Dr. Schechter.
Thank you, Tom. Before I get to this, let me just go back over our time together and to emphasize that through these different presentations, we've seen the importance of lessons that look at theory and ideas on one hand, history on the other, and current issues, and the relationship between those three legs of that three-legged stool is important in teaching, and I think it's essential in learning, that ideas matter, that we've seen that in this whole COVID period in our lives. People talk about federalism, they talk about separation of powers, emergency powers of the governor, civil rights and civil liberties. It all matters, as does civic engagement, to go back to one of the units. So history also matters. People have been surprised to learn that we've had pandemics and epidemics since the 1630s in America, and that we've responded to them publicly and not been fatalistic. We have no fatalistic past in us. When the first epidemic occurred, people responded and governments responded and local communities responded very, very proactively. The first thing they did was to institute quarantines and isolation. So that's been a part of American history from the very beginning. And I would submit to you, in thinking about how to bring this into the classroom, that keying issues that occur in real time to the ideas and theories and first principles you're teaching in civic education is important, and it's possible, and it's productive, and that keying events like a pandemic to history and asking students the question, how has public health played a role in American history, and how have Americans responded to it? It can be done. I know that you're under great pressure. I know that every time there's a crisis in terrorism or natural disasters or opioids or this or that, everyone looks at the social studies teacher and says, well, you know, what are you going to do about this in the classroom? And at the same time, they forget that the social studies teacher has less and less time, that there are other priorities in the school district now that take precedent. But I'm just saying that within that context, teaching in real time matters, and recourse to great ideas and great history matter in that teaching. And it's against that background that I provide some examples of how you can include public health in your teaching, whether it be in terms of background research that students are involved in the papers that they write. There are links in my long paper. There's one on I can't remember the title, but they give you quotes from people who lived through pandemics and epidemics throughout American history that you can bring into your teaching. Students can use their research skills and their writing skills. Public education is an important part of teaching social studies as well. How would you inform the rest of your school or your community about public health dangers and how to prepare for and respond to them? Curriculum. Maybe it is time to sit down and go through the curriculum and make certain decisions about where public health might fit in that curriculum. I mean, in the spread of infectious diseases is only one part of public health. Sexually transmitted diseases, substance abuse, widespread non-infectious diseases, from diabetes to obesity, environmental health hazards. These are all part of public health. And I think COVID was a wake-up call that we have to start taking public health more seriously, both in public education and in our teaching and in the relationship between them. Going through the curriculum, you saw the We the People curriculum. If there's a way to go back to the unit questions, Tom, is that possible? You know, we focused in our presentations on Unit 4, how the values and principles embodied in the Constitution shaped American institutions and practice, and focused on federalism as one of those principles. COVID and public responses to it fit there. But in looking through these, public health, policy, and crises generally, and COVID in particular, would fit in any one of these units, I think. Thomas, yes, am I right?
Yes.
And it becomes an important, I would say, important asset in teaching a program like We the People, and using its material to ask the practical current issues questions of every unit and relate them. So the last, you're going to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, just as an example, we talked a lot about mask wearing last night. And you might think, well, how does mask wearing fit in with the philosophical or historical foundations of the American political system? And even that does, in my mind. You know, We the People, I've been doing We the People for over 25 years. And, you know, it helps you to frame questions and issues in sort of the American tradition and all the nuance and disagreements that we find in the American tradition. So mask wearing, on the one hand, there are people, you know, the Kansas governor is requiring mask wearing July 3rd. And on one hand, we've got a whole bunch of people here in Wamego that are up in arms. And they're making liberty claims, that it's their individual right, their individual liberty is at stake in this mask requirement. So that's sort of the liberal side of our tradition. But we have a whole bunch of other people, not necessarily in Wamego, but probably in the big city like Kansas City or Topeka or Wichita, and also here in Wamego, but that say, no, this is a pandemic. This is the community, the protection of the community should be prominent here, and should be applied more than individual rights in this particular situation. So returning to those first principles is really what We the People, and in your packet, you received my favorite We the People lesson, a PDF of it, lesson 39. If you don't do anything else with We the People, if you're a U.S. history teacher or a civics and government teacher, get your kids, you know, provide them with some issues, some real live issues, and get them to take a position and reason their way through it. Fantastic. And that's just all I wanted to add, Stephen.
And if you look at these questions, you'll find that none of them asks none of them is phrased in a way like the question, is mask wearing, does mask wearing violate our civil liberties? They don't begin with the word does, they don't begin with the word is, they begin with what and how, sort of subconsciously in the teacher mind, in the curriculum writer's mind, to say, you know, you ask a question like, does mask wearing violate civil liberties? You'll wind up with a classroom divided between those who say yes and those who say no. When the answer is, and the American answer, our tradition of answering is, yeah, it does, but tough, tough, tough beans.
Tough bean.
Yeah, I mean, you can have, doesn't have to be either or. It's going to wind up being both one way or the other. And we sort of take for granted that teacher way of asking questions that you find here, or I find here in these units. What strikes me is the way that the questions asked.
And reasonable people can and oftentimes do disagree in the American tradition.
Yeah.
So we're running out of time. We've ended on time every session or close to it, and I want to continue with that. Again, if you have any questions about any additional questions about the We the People curriculum or how to teach about COVID-19 or any of the principles in Dr. Schechter's various outlines, I will email you with contact information for all of us. And again, we're doing this as a public service, and none of us are salespeople. We're not telling you that you have to buy something here at all. And we just really want to help you and help the public know more about COVID-19 and how it fits in to our framework of government, and to make wise choices as citizens and to help others make wise choices. So I'll send you contact information for everyone. Some of you have already sent me emails that you needed PD certification. No big deal. I've got the certificate saved on my computer. If you need that, just reach out to me and I'll shoot one in the mail to you. I think that certification with my signature on it, that powerful Vaughn signature on it, along with Schechter's outline, it's probably worth more than 6 hours, but we can give you at least 6 hours. We still are looking forward to creating some sort of ebook in the end with all this. And by the way, I'm not going to send you a bunch of stuff just because I have your email address. I have another job too. I work with lots of students at Kansas State University as well as doing this kind of stuff. And so, but I'll send you that at least. But don't feel afraid to reach out to me or any of us after this. We hope that we may be able to do more of these kinds of things. And Robert Leming and the center, of course, they're the national leader in civic education. They wrote the national standards for civics and government and run the We the People and Project Citizen programs and did a whole bunch of stuff internationally. And they're the ones that will ultimately decide how much more of this that we do. But I would like to think that this was a successful first foray into teaching in real time and teaching about a current topic that is connected to curricular anchors in the U.S. history and civics and government curriculum. And so we'll see. And Robert, I don't know if you want to say anything about the future, but I'll give you the last word, Professor Leming. And my last word will be thanking all of you for participating. We didn't know how this was going to work out, whether or not there would be any interest at all. And here we are on the 4th webinar and still have 60 people or so, which is really a testament to you and that you're interested in all this and you're willing to give up 4 summer nights to learn more about COVID and its connections to federalism. So finally, on behalf of Kansas State University Center for Social Studies Education, the Center for Civic Education, and the Johnson County First Amendment Foundation, thank you all for coming, and I thank all of our speakers and organizers. And I'll turn things over to Robert Leming for the last word.
Thanks, Tommy. I did see in the chat, I learned how to check the chat. A very important question that relates to state competitions and I believe the national finals next year. My suggestion for state competitions is to go, if you don't know who the state coordinator is in your respective state, then go to our website, the We the People website, click on the map and find the person that you need to contact about what's happening in your state. And concerning the national finals of April 21, I don't know. My ambition would be to actually hold 2 events, one in person and one on Zoom, because Zoom worked great and it's a lot less expensive to get than traveling to DC. So I don't know where we'll be next spring. I know everybody wants to go back to DC, but I don't know if it's going to be possible. I can't make that prediction right now. So in my mind, what I want myself to be thinking about and Center for Civic Education staff thinking about are the possibility of both events. Take this challenge and go farther with it. And if we are able to conduct a live event, great. If we can't, then we know we can do it on Zoom, which is, they're not apples and apples, they're different, but they both have advantages and disadvantages. So I'm happy that people are thinking ahead to that future. I just encouraged by the number of people involved in this webinar. I did see on the participants list a number of people, including state coordinators. I saw Sue Leeson, Justice from the Oregon Supreme Court, other people on here, so I'm happy that you're involved as well. That you have a big challenge for the fall. And you now have a network of people that you can help meet those challenges that you have for both yourself, the development of your curriculum, and what's going to happen with students. It's going to be a challenging year for everybody. But considering the history that Stephen Schechter has talked about and considering the history that we all know, I think that's a trait of Americans, that we meet challenges and we go for it. And I suspect that that's what's going to happen around the classrooms around the nation. And I think we're going to have great stories to tell come during the school year, as well as what happens in 2021, which we don't know. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for Tommy and Dr. Schechter for putting this on, and for Matt and Ken, who originated the idea, and Mark Gage, obviously, for his help on all of this. I do think that we are going to hold more of these kinds of things on different topics. I've talked to people about maybe doing something on the hearing questions that come out at the end of August in preparation for state and local competitions that will be occurring in the fall and in the early winter months. So stay tuned. If you like this, I think you're going to like more as we move along. So again, thanks everybody for being a part of this. Have a great 4th of July. Happy birthday to everybody. And we'll see you the next time.